Dr. Siouxsie Wiles, MNZM, is the head of University of Auckland's Bioluminescent Superbugs Lab, in which bioluminescence is used to advance the understanding of microbial infections, such as food poisoning, tuberculosis, and hospital superbugs. Her specialist areas are infectious diseases and bioluminescence. Here in New Zealand, she has been a steady, accurate, and calming presence throughout the COVID-19 crisis, working with the Prime Minister and others to make critical information accessible to everyone and help us better understand the complexities of the challenge. Siouxsie, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. And of course, we have to begin with the huge news out of New Zealand today. Can you talk us through it and help us understand what it means?
Yeah, so today our Prime Minister announced, so on Saturday our Prime Minister announced a 4-level alert system for COVID-19, much as many countries have for natural disasters. So we have this already for fire and various other things. On Saturday she moved us to level 2, which was a kind of the starting of restrictions about how we should behave, who should be isolating themselves and things like that. Today, she announced that we were moving to level 3, which meant more restrictions, but that within 48 hours, we would be moving to level 4, which is the highest restriction, which is essentially a shutdown of everybody and everything apart from essential services. And it's wow. I mean, she has acted so fast and so hard in order to protect New Zealand from COVID-19. It's just amazing.
Fantastic. And I am really eager to hear from you the wonderful work you've been doing to help us all better understand COVID-19. I'm going to turn it over to you to share your work with the world.
Thank you. So let me start by sharing my screen. And, oh, here we go. Now, has that worked? Oops. Hang on, I'm not sure it's worked yet. Sorry. Screen share. Okay. So I've been working with cartoonist Toby Morris, who is just this incredible cartoonist here in New Zealand. And we have been trying to develop some shareable images, I guess, that will help people understand this epidemic and help them see what actions they can take and maybe why the governments are taking the actions they are. So what I wanted to do was share these graphics that we've been making with you to explain really what it is about, epidemics, how they happen, how they stop, and a little bit about, I guess, the exponential spread of viruses. So what I'm showing you now on my screen is what we call an epidemic curve. And this is a curve that shows how the number of daily cases of a particular infection changes over time. And this curve essentially has 3 phases. So in the first phase, this is where we see the start of an epidemic, where the numbers of cases rise exponentially. And then in phase 2, you see this kind of plateauing of the epidemic. And then in phase 3, you see the epidemic receding. And so the number of cases basically start, they grow exponentially, they reach a peak, and then they start to drop off. Okay, so that's just this, and this is a concept that's well known in epidemiology, infectious diseases epidemiology. So the reason that this happens, and so this is related to a number called R0, or a thing called R0, which is essentially how infectious a microorganism is. And so this, it's a bit of a complicated number because it's sort of given one number, but actually it might depend on who's being infected, and we sometimes get these people who infect more than others. But essentially what this is a kind of rough number of every person that has an infection, how many people they will transmit that infection to. So in this example, we're going to start with one. So this one person, and in the relation to COVID-19, I guess what we have is a virus that is infectious for possibly 3 days before people start to show symptoms, but also that many people can have very mild symptoms. And what this means is that they can go about their daily business and essentially infect people. It's also a droplet spread virus. So this is not one that is airborne, but when people are shedding the virus, they shed it in droplets. Those droplets end up on surfaces, and then people can be touching surfaces, pick these viruses up on their hands, and then if they touch their face, they can enter into the body through the mouth, the nose, or the eyes. They can also enter, of course, through being coughed on and things like that if you cough in somebody's face. Okay, so we have this one person who is shedding COVID-19, and they will shed it, in this particular example, to 3 other people. Then each of those people will spread it to 2 or 3 other people. And then each of those people will spread it to 2 or 3 other people, and so on and so forth. And so this is where we get our exponential spread. And I guess the thing to say about COVID-19 is that we know the infectious period is about, or the incubation period of the virus is about 2 to 10 days. And so what we see when we start to see cases is really a reflection of what was happening, 1 to 2 weeks ago. Okay. So if we go back to our number of daily cases, this is how we see this kind of exponential spread. And so the question is, when we see these kinds of curves, why do they start to go down? So in a disease that is going through a population, what happens is we can imagine that all of us are susceptible, or a certain number of people in a population are susceptible. As people get the virus and spread the virus to other people, you start to run out of people who are susceptible to the virus. So essentially what happens is you have, as the number of cases rise, the number of susceptible people drops until you reach this stage where there are less and less susceptible people, and that's why the curve starts to go down. In the case of COVID-19, we have to assume that all of us are susceptible. I think the statistics are saying that maybe 70 to 80% of people within a population will get infected. But what China showed in Wuhan is that obviously you can change this curve, you can stop infections by doing things. So for example, by locking down countries, by stopping people moving, you can stop the spread of this virus. And then once people are not moving and spreading the virus anymore, your cases drop. And so that's exactly what China has done. Okay. So you might have heard of this concept of flattening the curve. And so I want to just kind of quickly talk about this, because one of the things that we're seeing with this, that you would see with any epidemic, I guess, is, what are the symptoms and how does it infect, or how does it affect people, and what impact does that have on your resources? So we have this curve that basically has a dotted line that represents, so in the case of COVID-19, would be representing hospital beds, intensive care units, and ventilators, because we know that people who struggle to breathe need to be put on ventilators. And so some people will have a very few of those resources, and others will have more. And what that means is that if we have a really exponential spread of this virus, that it can overwhelm people's resources, people's ability to deal with the virus, and then more people would die than would if you had your enough healthcare to look after people. The other thing, though, about having a healthcare system, of course, is that every country is already dealing with things. We all have hospitals, we've got people in them already. And so when we have this exponential spread, not only do we run out of the ability to care for those people, but we also run out of the ability to care for people who are just having the general stuff that happens in life, whether that's a stroke or a heart attack or something. Okay, so the idea about this is that we have this curve and we have this capacity to look after people, and that capacity will differ in different countries. But obviously, and what you don't want, I guess, is this epidemic going through and overwhelming your systems. Okay, so what China did, and we saw this really well, is when they started to run out of the ability to care for people, they just lifted their capacity, right? They built new hospitals in a matter of days. So that is one way that you can then keep everybody who needs to be treated kind of under within your capacity. But this has led to this idea of flattening the curve. So instead of having exponential spread, which overwhelmed your ability to deal with the situation, that you, and so the way Toby Morris and I illustrated this was with kind of like, if the attitude is, meh, this is just like, it's not anything serious, we're not going to do anything, or people are not going to change their behavior, then you end up with this epidemic spread. But you could, by behavior change, spread out the number of people who are being infected, and so in that way try and keep the number of infected below your ability to, or so be able to care for them, I guess, by keeping them below your capacity line. And so we illustrated this with people being careful, washing hands, not touching their face, staying home when they were ill, would help us slow the spread of the virus, and mean that we could care for people. The problem with this idea, and it went a bit crazy. So everybody's talking about flattening the curve. The problem with this idea is that it still requires everybody to get the disease. So you're still letting the disease run through the population, but you only want it to, I guess, have the minimum effect. And what China showed is that, that's 14% of people over the age of 80 will die. And that is not really what you want, right? Actually, we don't just want to spread these cases out. We kind of like to do something a little bit more drastic, like China showed with stopping it. So this led us to create another graphic called Stop the Spread. So what we showed in this was our first thing where everybody, we see this exponential spread because there's no real collective response. Everybody's kind of just doing whatever. And but what we really want to do, so this is essentially what we get with our epidemic spread. But what we wanted to show was that actually if we make collective action, we can actually stop these chains of transmission. And that's what we really want to do. We don't just want to slow it down. We actually want to stop people from getting infected. So the way that we illustrated this was, if we have that first person in the first example, they would have contacted 3 people. But if one of those people actually decided to work from home and wasn't a contact anymore, then you remove a whole series of subsequent infections. Similarly with the next ones, we had somebody who didn't go to a barbecue, and so this, was basically someone who doesn't do a social event. Again, removes a whole series of future infections, and so on and so forth. So we can show that by our actions, we can actually stop the transmission of the virus. But it requires us to understand that our actions need to happen now, because they will reflect what happens in 2 weeks' time. So the idea then was with Stop the Spread was actually we don't want to flatten the curve at all. We don't want all these people getting infected. We actually want to stop the virus. And so this is our strong collective response. It's everybody doing what they should be doing, cancelling events, working from home, not traveling, washing our hands, trying to keep the virus under control. And this is based on a really wonderful paper in The Lancet that just got published like a few days before we did the graphics, explaining why flatten the curve was such a bad idea and probably not really even possible. The problem with this model, though, is that if you release the measures too soon, you can end up with this basically coming back. So everyone goes, yay, we did it. And then they start going back to their normal behavior. But if the virus hasn't been eradicated, then you start to see this exponential spread again. So that brings me to New Zealand's response. So the really, I guess, amazing thing about being kind of at the end of the world in a small place that's far away from everyone is that we've been one of the last places to start getting cases, it seems. And so we've had a few sort of trickling. I think our first case has only been a few weeks ago. And as other countries started to develop such an issue because they weren't moving, I guess, fast enough to stamp it out, lots of Kiwis started to come home. And so over the last few weeks, we have actually now seen this sort of exponential growth in cases. But the vast majority of them have been in people who were infected overseas, came home before they realized they had symptoms, and then have basically kind of spread it from there. So about just over a week ago, our Prime Minister announced the first of our restrictions, which was that anybody who entered the country had to go into self-isolation for 2 weeks. And so the idea behind that was that people who were coming home, because there have been thousands of people trying to get back to New Zealand, that they would be in their homes for 2 weeks. And if they developed any symptoms, that they wouldn't be contacting anybody except the people in their household. The problem, of course, is that this has got a 2-week incubation period, and so we have had a week before that and time before that when people have likely been coming home, possibly incubating the virus, and then possibly spreading it and not realizing. So what our Prime Minister said was that if we had any cases of community transmission, so this is where the virus, where people infected, you can't be traced back to a case or to a travel case, that she would take more drastic action. And so that's what she did today. She has basically, we've had our first real indication today that we have community transmission. And so she is acting really fast, sort of possibly 2 weeks faster than most other countries, to say we're at a stage now where we could probably eliminate it if we worked fast enough. So today she announced a 4-week lockdown where, by Wednesday we won't be moving around, only essential services will be open. We're still allowed to go out for walks, but we have to stay away from other people. We have to stay 2 meters away from other people. And the hope is that we can, if everybody in New Zealand who has the virus already has their infection, it will allow us to still treat the hopefully small number of people who end up with a serious infection. But once it's done that its thing and it's infected people and they've mounted an immune response and recovered, and we've decontaminated all surfaces, then there should be no more virus. And then the question becomes, what happens with the rest of the world, and whether we have to stay shut down until we have a vaccine, which I guess is is a long time. And so this is it might be very strange that our lives might return to some weird sense of normality much sooner than lots of other countries where they're acting much slower than New Zealand has. But we've had the benefit of watching what's happened in other countries and realizing that we actually don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. So we've got very few numbers of ICU beds and very few numbers of respirators compared to other countries, including Italy. And we do not want to be in the position where our doctors are having to make decisions about who lives and dies because of our lack of resources. So that's where we're at. On Wednesday, we go into lockdown, and I guess we'll see in 4 weeks' time whether we were fast enough, whether we've managed to stop all that transmission, and whether we can eliminate the virus here. And then we rely on the rest of the world. That's me. So thanks, Kyla.